So this thing is amazing. Let's dive in and let's show you guys why cheap APS-C lenses, cheapish, are really worth considering for your full frame camera. But the first thing that you're going to notice about this lens is it's hefty. Now, if you're familiar with Fujifilm, you will know this lens turned up with a Fuji mount not so long ago and was absolutely phenomenal. Does it carry over here? Do the optics carry over? Well, straight out of the box, this thing feels legit. It feels solid. It feels heavy. Now, to take you guys through some of the features here really quickly, we got the lens cap, we've got the sun hood, and we've got a really solid focus whip. This whole lens screams quality. Then on the side here, we have a click or not. So if you want to click the aperture, hear it, or make it smooth, depending on what you're shooting, photo or video, depending, you might like to use one or the other. Then the other button, autofocus, manual focus, which is always handy to have for something like the Sony ZV-E1 because you don't have to dive into the menus. You can just hit this and it's manual focus. And then you've got a custom button, which you can completely customize to whatever you want within the Sony ZV-E1 or your camera's menus. Now, all that's like well and good. That's the basics. Big thing here is this is a super fast lens. It is f1.2. That's the aperture. What does that mean? In the simplest form, the lower the number of the aperture, so this goes to 1.2, then the blurrier the background. But that also comes with a downside, because the focal plane, while it's actually going to focus on at 1.2, is razor thin. It's just like not everything is going to be in focus. It could be just an eye, it could be like a blade of grass, it could be a hair, it could be anything. So 1.2, I don't think it's amazing looking for certain things, but then you've got that compression. Okay, so that means that at 27 millimeters, which is a really weird focal length, generally lenses are like 16, 20, 24, 16 to 35 and so on and so forth. 27 mil, I know Sigma do 28 mil, but 27 mil is just a weird focal length. But anyway, enough of me moaning about weird focal lengths. Now, this does give you a little bit of compression, which basically means the background is actually going to be closer to the subject. That's what it looks like. So lens optics, so things are kind of squashed in a bit, which looks really good. As you can see in this clip here, it looks phenomenal. So you've got that little bit of compression. It's a very kind of cinematic, filmic look to it. Now, obviously, this isn't a vlogging lens at 27 millimeters because yeah, it just heads everywhere. But all of that said, for other types of footage, including what you've seen here, it looks really good. Now, this thing looks tack sharp. It's really sharp. It's not really soft around the edges at any of the apertures. Obviously, f4 and up, kind of f4 to 8 is always the sweet spot with a lot of lenses, but this thing is sharp throughout. Chromatic aberration. Now, I know you're like, what the is chromatic aberration? Depending on what you shoot, how you shoot, and lots of kind of contrasty areas, so dark to light, you might see little fringes around different things. So it could be reds and greens and blues, that's what shows up. As you can see off my fancy test chart that everybody has in a lens review, but like people are like, I don't know what it means. Anyway, there's no real red and white. Okay, at 1.2, there's a tiny, minuscule little bit of aberration. I don't really see it that much. Maybe it's just my own eyes, but nonetheless, yeah, it ain't in there. This thing is amazing. Now, I'm sure for most folks, unless you have a really bad lens, you would never notice a lot of heavy chromatic aberration. So this thing, sharpness, phenomenal. Not soft, no chromatic aberration. Now, on a camera like the Sony ZV-E1, which is a full frame camera, or any other full frame camera for that matter, this thing is going to have a big butt vignette. What does that mean? Well, in standard form, depending on the camera you have, you might have a Super 35 mode where you can crop into the sensor, but in a lot of cases, you may not have that. What does that mean? This is what it means. You're looking through like a tunnel. However, in the Sony ZV-E1, if you go to active stabilization, that crops in a bit, which is, but dynamic stabilization more or less reduces and removes that vignette or that tunnel completely. Essentially, it's a smaller lens for a bigger sensor. So round peg square hole doesn't really work, but when you crop in or use a kind of an APS-C mode in the camera on a full frame camera, then it works. Now, how does this hold up in stabilization? A lot of folks will say Sony lenses work better with the Sony ZV-E1 when it comes to stabilization. I don't agree. I don't disagree either. However, what I have found, and with any electronic stabilization, which is an algorithm, the faster the shutter speed, this goes for the likes of GoPro as well, the faster the shutter speed, the higher that number it is. Like this was 1/320, it looked really, really good. This was all handheld walking on the surface of the moon, and it was really, really good. However, if you drop it down to that 1/50, then things start breaking up, and this is right across the board. I've seen it with Sony lenses, Sigma, and indeed Viltrox lenses. It just doesn't matter. Now, that aside, that works really well with the stabilization on the Sony ZV-E1, so you can do handheld stuff. As we know, that dynamic stabilization, whatever I called it a second ago, that's not it, it's dynamic stabilization, has that hefty crop, which works though with this APS-C lens. Now, here's the thing. APS-C lenses are really cheap compared to full frame lenses. That's a big thing. We're talking hundreds in the difference. Now, a lot of people will go, I can't really see the difference. So something like this is absolutely worth considering. Would I use something like this? Well, here's the thing. I feel something like this Viltrox 1.2 27mm lens is probably a very good sweet spot for portrait photography to a point, but more importantly, product photography. So you get that compression, you get that bokeh, you get that kind of insanely good look. So I think for product shots, this is a nice sweet spot to actually have. Now, with an aperture like 1.2, or any of those kind of super fast, wide open stuff, what you really need to think about is how you're going to focus this. Because that focal plane at 1.2 is minuscule, it's like razor thin, you do have to think about using autofocus quite a bit. Now, depending on the camera you have, you can actually dial in the autofocus, which is fine. But the autofocus on this, I have found it to be impeccable. There's always an argument, just before I show you some footage, there's always an argument that like a native lens, like a Sony lens for something like the Sony ZV-E1 will work a lot better when it comes to autofocus. But this thing just seems to absolutely nail focus 99.99% of the time. There's also a USB-C port on this, so if it comes to firmware updates, then I'm sure Viltrox will have it. Something to note, depending on the type of cage you have, this Falcon cage for the Sony ZV-E1, which is a really, really good cage, this stupid part in the front here has actually caused me to scratch this lens, because it was just a bit of a tight fit. So keep that in mind depending on the cage. This is a chunky lens. I haven't really found this problem with that Falcon cage in the past, but it's just something to note if you have this Falcon f22, f38 cage for the Sony ZV-E1 and this lens, or maybe other lenses as well. I gotta say, it's not a great design on Falcon, to be honest. It's their fault versus Viltrox fault. But anyway, that's just a point to note. I really can't think of any disadvantages with this. I know depending on what you're shooting, you may not want that vignette, that tunnel. You don't want to compromise the image in any way. But I think for the price this is compared to a full frame equivalent, this is absolutely worth considering. And when you take a look at the image quality, this thing has been known as sharp. Now at f16 it starts losing a slight little bit of contrast, but again, this is all things that you can't really not fix in Lightroom if you're going in that way. And speaking of Lightroom, this lens is not even out yet. So thanks to Viltrox for sending me this for review. Now, for full disclosure, this is going to review the lens. Initially, I turned it down because I didn't have time to do it. Now, they came back and said, do you want to review the lens again? I was like, okay. So this is about to come out. So there is no lens profile for the likes of Lightroom or anything right now. So just keep that in mind. Obviously, when Adobe update Lightroom, that's what happens. And other software manufacturers, they just update it and that's it. But this lens hits all the marks. Is it as good? I haven't used this on the Fuji, but at the same time, from all of the reviews I've read of the Fuji version of this thing seems more or less exactly the same. And the fact that there is no real downsides, except this is heavy lens. This is a heavy lens. I mean, okay, this isn't scientific, but with the cage and with the body of the Sony ZV-E1, to this hand, this is heavy. I mean, this is a serious piece of glass. This is Viltrox Pro line as well. I guess if we're going to be honest, right, you could go, well, why don't I just spend the money on a 16-35? Right? Which I guess is a fair point. However, that's a lot of money for the full frame. That's a lot of money. Could you get an equivalent APS-C lens? Yeah, I'm sure you could. But I think just having a prime lens, this 27mm focal length, it's a bizarre focal length. Why it's not 28, why it's not 24, whatever, I'll leave that up to Viltrox. But it's just kind of hitting that sweet spot for compression. The bokeh looks really smooth, really nice. And again, that 1.2 thing is a look that's absolutely not for everybody, but tack sharp. What it focuses on, tack sharp. Gotta say, really, really impressed with this. And I think just as a whole, lenses are something that you can amass quite a lot of. I've got a whole bunch behind me here, and they're all different focal lengths. And I guess the thing really is that you gotta have your wide. You gotta have like the telephoto, like the big ones. And then you've got to have something kind of in the middle that will do portraits, that will do product. And I think this is definitely hitting that magic word that I've said for the 929th time in this video, sweet spot. Anyway, speaking of the Sony ZV-E1, I absolutely love this camera. It's a little bit overpriced, but if you want to see all of the important settings that you absolutely need to know on the Sony ZV-E1, this video will look after you. Watch it, subscribe. Thanks, love you, bye.